Welcome to the session on George Bernard Shaw and his legacy. My name is Daniel Carey, and I'm director of the Moore Institute at NUI Galway, and I'm a vice president of the Royal Irish Academy. It's great to be part of this collaboration between these two institutions. I'd like now to introduce you to Ruth Hegarty, who's managing editor of the Royal Irish Academy. Ruth, over to you.
Hello, good morning and good afternoon. We're delighted to have so many of you signed up. Over 130 people from around the world as we mark another Shaw Day, with this year the 70th anniversary of Bernard Shaw's death, and the year that he's about to come out of copyright as well at the end of this year. This event is hosted by the Moore Institute in NUI Galway, and we're very grateful for that in collaboration with us at the Academy. I run the publishing house of the Academy, and in 2017 we published Judging Shaw by Fintan O'Toole and ran Shaw Day. We've been celebrating it since then. We ran a festival in Ireland and around the world. This event is to mark the forthcoming issue of the journal Shaw, which I guest edited with Barry Houlihan of NUI Galway. So we decided to host this event, this webinar, to discuss some of the debates emerging from the papers, and we're delighted that we have so many of the authors here to discuss them. We've divided this hour into two sections, and the editor of the journal then, Chris Wixon, will join us at the end. If you have any questions at all, please put them in the Q&A, and the moderator for each of the sessions will direct them to the panelists. I'll jump in around 25 past to pass over to the second panel, which will be moderated by the playwright Colin Murphy on Shaw and politics, which is something we're all a bit obsessed with at the moment with the elections on tomorrow. Now I'm going to hand over to my co-editor Barry Houlihan, who is moderating the first panel on Shaw Talk, Shaw and Language. Over to you, Barry.
Great, thanks so much, Ruth, for the introduction, and good morning and a good afternoon, everyone who's tuned in to this session on Shaw Talk. It's my pleasure to introduce two panelists in our first session of today's discussions. There will be obviously a lot of Shaw talk and provocations and discussions stemming not least of all from the special themed issue of Shaw, the Journal of Bernard Shaw Studies, but also reflecting on at least some of the contributors to that journal issue and some of their reactions and reflections on the theme of Shaw and talk and language. First of all, it is my pleasure to introduce briefly our two panelists for this first portion of the discussion. First of all, Dr. Adrian Patterson, who is a lecturer in this parish here in NUI Galway, a lecturer in English. Adrian publishes widely on 18th, 19th and 20th century literature. He has a particular interest in the artistic interactions of modernism and Irish literature. Adrian is president of Modernist Studies Ireland. He is the curator of Yeats and the West, a multimedia exhibition now on view at Tour Ballylee, or at least it would be in normal times, but it is there. And it's also located at the Yeats Memorial Building in Sligo. Adrian has published widely on writers such as Shaw, not least of all in the forthcoming special issue, also on Joyce, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Thomas Moore, and he is the author of the monograph Words for Music, W.B. Yeats and Musical Sense. He's also the co-editor with Tom Walker and Charles Armstrong of the forthcoming Edinburgh Companion to W.B. Yeats and the Arts. The other panelist for this session is Dr. Aileen Ruane, who is a postdoctoral scholar in the Department of French Studies at Concordia University in Montreal. Her current research focuses on performative feminisms and performing femininities in theatrical translations between Quebec and Ireland. Aileen's work has been published in Ilia de Distoro, a journal of English language literature in English and cultural studies. And Aileen has also published widely on George Bernard Shaw, not least of all, again, in the forthcoming issue of Shaw, the Journal of Bernard Shaw Studies, which we'll hear more on presently, but also chapters in the recent Bernard Shaw and the Making of Modern Ireland, which has been edited by Audrey McNamara and Nelson O'Kelly-Ritchell and published by Palgrave Macmillan. So it's my pleasure to virtually be with Aileen and Adrian as part of this discussion. If I could perhaps turn to Adrian, first of all, and discuss your contribution to the journal, but also some wider thoughts on Shaw and voice, which is really, I think, the heart of what your paper was about, is that question of Shaw, the medium of voice, not just through the language on stage, but also through the technology of voice and how Shaw has been influenced by various elements of that. If I could perhaps turn to you to begin that reaction.
Yeah, thank you so much, Barry. Thank you, Ruth. Can you hear me okay? Is this
We
working?
can,
Oh,
yeah.
great. Okay. Well, I instead of going kind of through my paper, what I thought I'd do was think about some of the issues, some of the reasons I was writing the way I did. I mean, it partly came actually from a session that Barry and Ruth organized in New York, where I was talking to Fintan O'Toole, and where we discovered a kind of common fascination with this George J. Lee, who was, if you like, the surrogate father and perhaps the real father of George Bernard Shaw. And when the topic for the journal arrived, this idea of legacy, it seemed to me interesting to kind of go backwards and go forwards with an idea of legacy. I mean, this strange mentor figure to Shaw, who in fact, you know, gave him his first start as a writer, really, as a music critic, ghostwriting his columns on the Hornet, is only part of Shaw's kind of larger inheritance. When he talks about his own life, he tends to do it in kind of comically musical terms, where he has uncles who kind of melodiously moo on the euphonium, or perhaps aunts and sisters and a mother who play the piano and sing. And George J. Lee was a vocal coach. That's what he did. And he was hugely influential in Shaw's life, so I'm sure you'll know. And the most obvious thing to look at when it comes to vocal coaches is, of course, Pygmalion and the figure of Henry Higgins coaching Eliza. And it seemed to me that he was not just an elocutionist, although singing teachers tended to be very good elocutionists in order to have the clipped consonants that Shaw required in a public speaker, or singers require in order for their words to be even remotely heard in an opera hall. He was also clearly a vocal coach in some way. He shares a name, Higgins, with the director of Covent Garden at the time, or the general manager of Covent Garden. And also his equipment, if you like, has the characteristics of a vocal coach. He has, for instance, well, a piano, largely speaking. He also has kind of tuning forks and things, and he has a big poster of The Voice as produced by a kind of cut through of a head as part of the stage directions that's required to be on stage. And that actually comes directly from George J. Lee's frontispiece for The Voice. And so in some way, Higgins, I think, is some kind of interesting cipher for George J. Lee, who was himself a vocal coach and also wrote this, or ghost wrote this book called The Voice, in which it's in three parts, really. First part is about the history of Irish music, which kind of culminates in Handel's Messiah being performed in Dublin. It's secondly about a kind of mechanical history of, or mechanical idea of what the voice does in terms of dissections of the larynx. And if I had my copy here, I would show you. I'm not in my office, but if I did, I'd be able to show you wonderful kind of cross sections of what the inside of the brain and vocal cords look like. And the third thing is a bit more of a kind of generalized version of how you might live, and a kind of individualized version of how the body might exist in the world, which includes advice on how to eat, keeping windows open, sensible clothing, the sort of thing that Shaw himself kind of becomes obsessed with. But in Pygmalion, I think what's interesting is that Eliza seems to me finally, because of this legacy, seems to me finally, as well as a very fine pianist, she's said to be a genius in picking up music and playing it. And she's also a singer. That clearly the music that she plays is quite often, it's not only Beethoven, which might be song, but also Lehar and Lionel Monkton and so on. And this is described as, you know, through a kind of vocal aria, I think. So I then became interested in what Barthes calls the grain of the voice and how this might tell us something. Classical media theory says that about in the fin de siècle period, the voice, because of technology and because of its mediatization, was, if you like, desexualized. Like it was taken away from the body and therefore becomes degendered and desexualized. That's the word that Kittler uses. I have some doubts about that, because the people exploiting vocal technology at the time are really two categories of people. One is singers who, whether they're Nellie Melba, who gives, you know, name to a dessert, or other famous singers, John McCormack and others, are actually exploiting the phonograph, the record player, soon the radio, to very much sexualize voices, because these are operatic voices. They're very much in both senses sexualized. They're gendered and also have a kind of sexual application to do with, you know, eroticism. And that, I think, is something that very clearly interests Shaw, and it allows Eliza to have this possibility of being a, well, some kind of autonomy, because she could have gone on to become a singer. That's clear that she has that proficiency. Why this matters now, it seems to me, I mean, I'm doing something very odd, right? I'm speaking to a microphone to you all with this kind of depresenced version of my vocal existence is given to you all. And that seems to me in itself interesting. There's been studies done about the changes in our voices over lockdown. Some people who have been only using electronic devices and not able to speak to anyone else have had their vocal resonance changed, according to a study done from Trinity College Dublin. So there's that kind of particular interest. I think it also clearly right now talks to the mediatization of the world and how the grain of the voice or the tone of the voice actually speaks to a version of truth, whether that's in presidential elections. That in the last one, many observers thought that Trump beat Clinton because people preferred Trump's voice, which seems, studies have suggested that lower tones of voices are approved more generally by both men and female voters, oddly enough. But not just that, it seems to me there's a kind of nowness, a kind of false or indeed real presence in a stage production that seems to me to matter. And so thinking about different iterations of the voice in that sense is clearly something that matters to Shaw. I wanted also to get in something that wasn't just Shaw. So the obvious analog for Eliza in Pygmalion is Florence Farr, who Shaw wrote and badgered persistently over a number of years to speak in the way that he wanted her to. But she also wrote plays, and she prizes something slightly different, I think. She writes Egyptian plays in which being true of voice, which is a direct translation of Egyptian hieroglyphs, Markaratu, which is what you do when the soul is weighed in judgment. You have to be found true of voice in a kind of vocal authenticity and truth, is something that's emphasized in her plays that cuts athwart, I think, slightly Shaw's version of what the voice can and should do. Except I found myself finding more and more similarities. So to go beyond Pygmalion to look at Caesar and Cleopatra, in which Caesar's voice is made manifest by trumpets very often and his kind of own grand manly voice. Cleopatra speaks almost like a schoolgirl, but in fact, she troubles the Roman concern with logic and a kind of masculine type speaking by herself producing manifestations of the other world, and really troubles these kind of otherwise grizzled Roman soldiers through the use of voice. And she becomes a kind of medium for the spirits. And Shaw was clearly, although skeptical of some of those things that Florence Farr and W.B. Yeats were interested in, has in a sense a common musical inheritance with Yeats and Synge and those other people in Dublin. But I think is also clearly interested in what the voice can do to talk about truth. And so if you come to, St. Joan or something, you have a figure who's essentially in some ways a medium who says that the voices come to her and she speaks and commands armies through her voice. And that there's something powerfully accessible to truth that goes beyond ourselves when we speak, which means that vocal coaching and thinking about how the voice is done is not just merely a means to an end, which Shaw claims it is. It's something more almost religious, almost kind of mystic. He's sort of groping at that, I think, and that's something of great interest to me. And clearly, in the fin de siècle period, those people again are also women. The people who are singers are sexualized, so to speak, in terms of their vocal arrangements are singers, but also mediums were nearly always gendered female. That's one of the artistic avenues open to them. And I think he was, despite his skepticism, interested in that.
That's great, Adrian. Thank you for that. And I think there are so many points there that neatly link into some of Aileen's research as well, which is looking at that. I think some of the questions about gender and form and desexualization of the form, where the voice kind of betrays that physical form as well. And I know, Aileen, you are looking a lot at Shaw and performance and the performativity, not just of Shaw, but of the performativity of feminism and of female form on stage. And one aspect of that you've been looking at in detail is about St. Joan and about production histories of St. Joan specifically. So again, is there some points you might want to open up with, and then we can look at maybe some discussion as well, if there's a point maybe about, I think it was St. Joan from the 1970s at the Abbey Theatre, directed by Lelia Doolin, through to Patrick Mason's production in 1998. So if there was some points you wanted to react to on that.
Unmute. My Wi-Fi is not the greatest, so if it freezes for a second, like it's telling me it's doing now, apologies.
No, you're fine.
Okay, so well, first I owe a big thank you to Dr. Houlihan for helping me out with the archival research portion of this. I was supposed to be on site doing the research for this essay, and COVID kind of quashed those plans pretty soundly. So what I wanted to look at from the beginning, just having the language in St. Joan and that of its reception, because Shaw's very clear in his preface about what he wants and does not want from the performances, the staging, set design, everything of that nature. And yet he also opens it up in a way to a lot of interpretation by he himself stating that his vision is corrective in the end. He takes a lot of pains in the preface to criticize Twain and Lang and others for not getting Joan right. But he himself also will say in the same vein that his view is right, but after that it depends on your own interpretation. So reception kind of featured really heavily because the language in it tells us a lot about the current production, or Patrick Mason's production specifically, how that would attempt to ally itself with Shaw's work. And if you look at a lot of the reviews from the press cuttings portion anyway, almost all of them spend more time discussing what they thought Shaw meant than they did the production itself. There was a lot more discussion of what Shaw meant. No one would be specific about what they actually believe that to be, but there was a lot of mentions of Shaw meant this or Shaw didn't mean that, and this production therefore was successful or unsuccessful for the following reasons. A lot of that, of course, centers on Joan herself and the actress playing her. In Mason's case, it was Jane Brennan. And something that I found interesting as I was going through the archives and in discussions with Dr. Houlihan was the age of Joan. She would have been, in her late teens, historically speaking, but Shaw embodied Shaw's ideal Joan. Most other stage productions too, Joan is typically much older. The only really young Joans that we see are cinematic Joans. Lily Sobieski back in the 90s. And would have been. And yet you have the ideal Shavian Joan being so womanly, being so strong. And there, again, some of the reviews were none of them really touched on Joan's age. Only a couple did. You had Bruce Arnold, who mentioned that that Jane Brennan didn't really play the role with any sense of youth in it. Jerry Colgan's review had cited her as being boyish in her embodiment, but that boyishness was actually useful because in the end it mitigated Brennan's age. She was in her 30s, I believe, when she was Joan in Mason's production. So there was this interesting interplay there, just to tie it back to one of the objectives of the article was to look at St. Joan in Ireland with authority and how that's embodied. Because if you're looking at authority and age and Irish women on Irish stages, Shaw's Joan is challenging different orthodoxies. And that would make sense then for her to have this kind of older presence in spite of the historical age. But there is this gap there because she needs to have this authority to challenge other authorities, but still maintain this kind of youthful spirit, this sense of, she's being an upstart, as Shaw describes her. So in an Irish context, especially in a Celtic Tiger context, which is something that I touch on in the conclusion to the article, she's challenging orthodoxies of state and church especially. And this is a period where much more information is starting to come to light about church and state collusion with regards to laundries and industrial schools, mother and baby homes, and systemic abuse. So having that age, that weight, if you will, to an embodiment is helpful, but it's still, if we're looking at Shaw's corrective vision, that's still not a teenager anyway. So I guess that's a bit to start. I don't know if that's
yeah, that's great. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Aileen, and to Adrian. I think you've both really set out so many interesting points that even though looking at temporarily different time spans of Shaw's influence, the resonances and overlaps are there. And perhaps not ironically, the voice of Shaw channeling through across those two contributions from you both. I can just maybe remind those tuned in as well, we do have a Q&A function on screen as well at the bottom. If there's any questions for our speakers, we do have about 5 minutes or so to take any questions. And in the meantime, maybe just ask Adrian and Aileen perhaps a piece to think about or reflect on in the interim, waiting for any questions, is that idea of voice. And again, even Adrian, and to reflect on your own contribution, is plays like Pygmalion. Would they have existed without Lee's The Voice in itself? Did Shaw take those resonances of voice from other angles, or did he channel that maybe perhaps exclusively from that handbook, as you describe it in the paper?
Thanks, Barry. I mean, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I don't think it's exclusive. I mean, in part of what I was trying to suggest in the final article was just a hint of the atmosphere of 19th century Dublin as a kind of vocally obsessed universe. I mean, the obvious picture of that, probably familiar to all of you, is Joyce's Ulysses, which is of course set a bit later in 1904 than Shaw was growing up. But this idea that there's a kind of vocal music obsession in 19th century Dublin, which has a lot to do, I think, with the growth of not only the Palestrina choir, which is Edward Martin's contribution to the revival, or one of his contributions, but also the Abbey Theatre. Many of the actresses in the Abbey Theatre were also singers or elocution teachers, which is what you did. And I think that's comes in part from something Shaw also describes in his, as I say, his autobiographies are also very often kind of musical, kind of comic, pathetic versions of his life. He tends to do it through music, and that in itself is interesting, that he seems to have grown up with the idea that not just music, but vocal music particularly was something important. I mean, of course, he writes about that himself, as the idea of his plays as operas, and learnt more from Mozart and Beethoven than he did from his contemporary playwrights, and I'm sure he's exaggerating. But I suppose to see George J. Lee as a center of that universe in Dublin, who was someone putting on concerts and training loads of singers for, the ancient concert rooms or ancient concert rooms in Dublin. And Shaw, eventually follows him to London and starts, playing along to his rehearsals. He's the pianist for all the rehearsals. He, I perhaps should have said, was going to not only ghost wrote his music column, was going to ghost write or rewrite a third edition of this book, The Voice. And Lee dies and Shaw eventually abandons the project. But again, looking at the manuscripts, it seems clear that it wasn't an immediate abandonment. So there's something of, I don't know, Lee and all that Shaw does related further than just to The Voice and to music, but I think that's a central preoccupation. But it comes to have ideas about the liberation of the body. And I think of the possibility of, if you like, it comes to kind of close to kind of the idea of religious truth. St. Joan says, what does she say? She says, the voices are not my own. I give my reasons after the voices come first. And though he's such a political writer, I'm sure we're going to be thinking about him as a politician. That seems to me something crucial, that in some way the voice, something a priori comes through the voice, is almost channeled through the voice. And then you come up with your reasons, your logical arguments. But for sure, it seemed to me that was not the first thing, that actually some kind of almost supernatural spiritual voice came first, and something he didn't deny. I mean,
okay, Great. I do see one or two questions coming in, and just before I get to those, I'm just going to put a question to Aileen first, if I may, and that is a question or a piece you raised is very interesting. Is about that authority and almost the body language as well, not just vocal language, but body language of who was cast in the role of Joan. And obviously Siobhan McKenna has become synonymous with the role in Ireland and internationally. Mm-hmm. But in the archival research you did, which was so detailed, do you see discrepancies in the memory of Joan as well, in the physicality of her as a character? Even as far as recently, I think, wasn't there an error in how one critic remembered or misremembered who was?
Yes. Yeah.
You could maybe just expand on that.
Yeah, I believe it was from The Guardian, Mick Moroney, who, when he was criticizing Mason's production, referenced Siobhan McKenna's iconic translation and production of it. But he said, the last time that the Abbey had exhumed the play was in 1972 with Siobhan McKenna in the role of Joan. And it wasn't, of course, Siobhan McKenna at the time at the Abbey Theatre or in that role. So that, and I think that's part and parcel of why it's so important to have these archives available, is mistakes like that can be made and you take them for granted. I know I read it and nodded, and then a second later thought, oh, wait a minute, that's not right. And then looked and it was like, nope, it wasn't Siobhan McKenna at all. But that's just, it speaks to her embodiment becoming disembodied as such, where it casts a shadow over all other productions. She's the Irish Joan for all intents and purposes. It doesn't matter what production or what stage in which she was sure. Performed it. So her own authority, long after she's passed away, has become something that is deeply inextricably linked with that legacy of Joan and Shaw in Ireland.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
Aileen, actually, I have a question, if I may. I mean, related to what you're saying, is there any comments on the kind of vocal presence that she has as an actress, or indeed any of the music of the production? I mean, I saw a 2018 Broadway production, I think, with Condola Rashad and the music of Bill Frisell, who's a kind of jazz guitarist, actually, I think. But they made kind of prayer very much central to that production, partly through lighting and other things, but her voice was kind of very powerful. Do people comment at all on her vocal presence? Whether, because clearly someone like Shaw is obsessed with getting an actress with vocal presence as much as with physical presence, although the two, according to his teacher, come to the same thing, actually.
Right, and you look at his music criticism, and there's a tension always there between training and performance. So yeah, I think that definitely relates. There isn't a mention from what I saw of Siobhan McKenna's voice as being integral, but there were a couple of reviews about Brennan in which they described her voice as kind of husky and having that taking away from the production. Which again, they're citing Shaw and they're saying Shaw wouldn't have wanted this. She lacks the ethereal spirituality that is necessary for the role, when Shaw was very clear that he did not want ethereal spirituality. But so yeah, the voice does come into play. It's not mentioned as much as you would have thought, given what you just cited regarding the voice. But there are a few mentions of her being too boyish and the accent too. Mason took pains to have the accent be Irish for these productions. So there's a whole other thing there, as David Clare has written about Shaw not wanting Joan, even though she's supposed to, there's a relationship with Ireland, not wanting her to appear Irish, too Irish. So he wanted the accent not to be an Irish accent.
That's very interesting.
Thanks so much to you both. We do have one or two questions coming in on the, but I think we may have reached, or even by a couple of minutes, our time for this panel. But I think that's very understandable given the depth and breadth of discussions going on here. Perhaps
I can try and answer them writing.
One is a comment actually, which I'll just read out, and it's from Peter Gahan. Again, just responding to voice, singers, and mediums. The main Shaw character, who is a medium, literally becomes a voice at the climax of the play, and that's Mrs. George in Getting Married. So that was just a comment from Peter. But I feel we are a little bit, I think, over time on this one. But I'd like to hold maybe the questions until the end. We might be able to return at the end and see, can we fit in some more questions then? And we might be able to pick up a little bit of time by then. Maybe just for now, just thanks so much to both of you, to Adrian Patterson and to Aileen Rowan for, I think, really stimulating opening panel discussion. Standing by, just absolutely seamless there, was Colin Murphy popping up on screen in front of me. And I'm going to pass over to Colin, who's going to moderate the next panel.
Thank you very much, Barry. Good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are. So I'm joined by two fellow panelists. Sudaba Anani Sarab is a lecturer in drama at Birmingham City University. She's currently working on a monograph on Shaw's relationship with the British regional repertory movement. Nicky Green is Emeritus Professor of English Literature at Trinity College Dublin and a member of the Royal Irish Academy, and he's currently working on a book about farming in modern Irish literature. And I adapted Fintan O'Toole's book, Judging Shaw, for a promenade performance at the Royal Irish Academy for the first Shaw Day, which was produced by the theatre company Anu. So we're here today to talk about a contrarian, a man obsessed with celebrity, a man with a fondness for authoritarians, and a delight in trolling right-thinking liberals. The eve of Donald Trump's bid for re-election seems like a good time to open a discussion about Shaw's legacy in the realm of politics. To ask, when it comes to political debate, political discourse, political ideas, as the title of Nicky's article puts it, can we still take Shaw seriously? Well, one place where I was, in my ignorance, intrigued to discover that Shaw has long been taken seriously is in Iran. Sudaba, will you tell us about the Iranian TV series, Shahrazad?
Yeah, of course. So I came across this topic by chance almost. I've always known that Shaw has had a presence in Iranian public consciousness just from stories I've heard about how people are familiar with Shaw's work. And I myself encountered Shaw's work when I was doing my undergraduate degree in Iran. But one day I was watching this very popular TV series in Iran called Shahrazad. And Shahrazad is a show that's set in 1950s Iran. So it starts immediately, more or less, in the aftermath of the 1953 coup in Iran, when Iran's then democratically elected Prime Minister Mossadegh was overthrown. And in this program, what I noticed was that in the study of one of the characters, so Shahrazad is named after the protagonist of the TV series by the same name, her main love interest, Farhad. In his study, there are two portraits. One of them is of Shakespeare and the other is of Shaw. And Farhad is a revolutionary. He's very much interested in modernist poetry and literature as well. So he's always talking about what he's reading, and that's feeding into some of his kind of political activities and interests as well. As I was watching this program, I started to think about two things. One, that Shaw seems to have had a presence in Iranian public consciousness in the 1950s, at least as early as the 1950s. But also that he seems to have still a presence, bearing in mind that this is something that was shot and created in 2015. I think the first series was released. So it seems that Shaw has had this presence all the way from the 1950s to today. So then I started to explore this a bit further, going into the National Library in Tehran to look at the ways in which Shaw has spoken to Iranian readers and audiences. And by the end of that journey, I kind of came back full circle, which again relates to Shahrazad. Often Shahrazad is read not as a dramatization of life in Iran in the 1950s, but almost as an extended metaphor for life in Iran today. So as a TV show that's getting around the censor by being placed in the 1950s, but thinking about politics and socio-political issues and concerns in Iran today. So I wasn't surprised that by the end of that research, I found that Shaw was still a figure that was discussed in Iran. So I end the article with a 2015 reading of Don Juan in Hell. So it kind of came back full circle, which links back to Shahrazad as a dramatization of life in the 1950s, but something that's very contemporary in many other ways as well.
So the the portrait of Shaw in the background, in the bedroom of the hero. I mean, what that sounds immediately to me is the Che Guevara portrait. And as a dramatist, it's something, you know, that the writer sticks on the wall, and there's a shorthand that communicates, okay, this person is anti-establishment or rebellious or whatever. What's the shorthand that Shaw portrait is communicating to the TV audience in Iran?
I think, again, I suppose some of that knowledge needs to come from what you know about Shaw. But after I did a bit more research of what people might have known in 1950s about Shaw, I think, again, it's communicating to us that Farhad is a revolutionary, that he's an anti-establishment figure, and that he's on the political left in the 1950s. And I think that's how people viewed Shaw in the 1950s, as a revolutionary, and in some ways as a critic also of imperialism as well.
Mm-hmm. Nikki, do we have you there? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
I'm here.
Nikki, if the hero of a Netflix hit series had a portrait of Shaw in their bedroom, how do you think it would go down on Twitter?
I have absolutely no idea. It seems improbable to me that such a person would even have heard of Bernard Shaw. I mean, that's really what I was trying to get at, is, you know, is he still a figure as far as we're concerned? Can we take him seriously? When Ruth first suggested that I write about Shaw for this volume, I thought, no, I have nothing left to say about Shaw. I've written quite a bit about Shaw in the past and so on. And then I thought, well, okay, we're talking about Shaw and legacy. What are the ideas there? And can we still engage with them? Do they actually mean something? I was very interested in the article about Shaw's presence in Iran, because clearly there are places where what he stood for, what he still stands for, may have an impact. But I think that the basic ideas, certainly his ideas about science and medicine, his ideas about philosophy, really don't stand up anymore. And politics, he's an important presence. There's no question about it, through his own time. But again, I'm very doubtful about the central ideas, whether they stand up at the moment.
Yeah. Would you, for people who might not be familiar with them or be surprised by them, would you just give us a quick overview of his more controversial interjections into politics? I mean, he it's fair to say he flirted with fascism, is it?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I think that it really has to do with impatience with the democratic system. He was always, as you said, a contrarian. He was always arguing against the establishment, and particularly arguing against liberals. He was to the left of the Liberal Party. The Fabian Society that he was involved with, sort of left-wing think tank, were always trying to ginger things up. And they were prepared to work with any party, liberals or conservative, if they could get their policies accepted. But as time went on, Shaw became more and more impatient with the democratic system. The fact that the Labour Party joined in coalition government in the 1920s and 1930s and got nowhere with it. Further, I mean, this Ramsay MacDonald was somebody he knew quite well, the Prime Minister of the time. It didn't work for him. So by the 1930s, he is really interested and attracted to what Stalin particularly is doing. He always thought of himself as a communist, and he went to Russia, and Stalin completely sold him a bill of goods, and he came back raving about Stalin's communism. But there are also approving things to be said about Mussolini and about Hitler, and this is disturbing stuff. Even if we accept, and I think it probably is true, that to some extent it's a rhetorical ploy. He's using the as a stick to beat the democratic system with. All the same, it's It's backing the wrong side in the 1930s. There's no question about that.
Can we look at, you both write about man and Superman in particular. Can we just drill down into that a little? Nikki, I mean, the Nietzschean Superman did not have a good 20th century. And not only that, but this play reads as unstageable. I mean, it's absolutely mammoth, and much of it isn't even written as drama. Talk to us for a moment, and then I'll come back to you, Sudaba, about whether that play has any role in the canon today.
Well, I mean, you just have to look at a 2015 production by the National Theatre with Ralph Fiennes in the lead role. It was fantastically successful. It was absolutely wonderful. I mean, I saw that only live streamed on the screen, but I saw the production back in 1981, and again, one was absolutely held in the theatre. I mean, there's no question to my mind. The most basic misconception of Shaw, which was around in his own time, is he's really just a preacher. He's not a playwright. They're just walking ideas. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is a playwright to the tips of his fingers, and the ideas are crucial. The ideas in Man and Superman. But what you have is a remarkable piece of theatre, even if you include Don Juan in Hell, which he didn't ever think was going to be staged. But if you play the whole play with the Don Juan part in it, it's a stunner.
Yeah, I just dipped back into that this afternoon, and actually it's electric, the Don Juan act. Sudaba, that has an Iranian history as well.
Yes, it does. It was translated first by Ibrahim Golestan, who is a well-known director and also writer as well, who's actually living in the United Kingdom now. And he translated that play, and later on he staged it, a director production. And that particular production and the translation as well, because he makes certain changes to Shaw's text, was a direct criticism on the Pahlavi regime, and especially Shaw's then Prime Minister Amir Abbas Hoveyda. So he dressed up the devil in a way that reminds the audience of Hoveyda. So he has a flower in his lapel, which was a signature, kind of the signature style of Hoveyda. Now, Hoveyda was someone who was very articulate, was very well read. He was interested in the French New Wave, for instance. But at the same time, he had very questionable political affiliations as well. Often he drew on his charm, the fact that he was very articulate to defend the Pahlavi regime and its violations of human rights. In that particular translation, Golestan also inserts lines to draw attention to censorship in the Pahlavi regime. So this was a time in the kind of the 1960s and 70s, the Shah introduced a series of reforms in the hope of modernizing Iran. On the left, some people saw these reforms as being too extravagant, being wasteful, and not being properly managed. And on the other hand, you have all these kind of reforms trying to modernize Iran, but increasingly writers were also dealing with censorship. So there's a bit in the translation where the devil is ripping pages out of a book. So Tanner asks him, what are you doing? And he's saying, oh, I can't remember the exact lines, but he's saying something along the lines that it's useless. These are things that shouldn't be said. And that's just immediately before Don Juan makes the decision to leave. And interestingly, Golestan later also made the decision to leave Iran as well, just before the revolution. And just going back to Nikki's point about Shaw's politics, what's really interesting about Shaw's politics are the questions that he asks and the criticisms that he raises, not always the solutions that he offers. And interestingly, those questions and those ambiguities are often present in his drama, just for the very nature of the way that theatre works, but also as early as the quintessence of Ibsenism, he tells us that he's doing away with conventional morality, and by extension, he's doing away with conventional understandings of hero and villain. So what you end up in his plays are characters and, that kind of debate on stage. You have characters who are, from their multiple points of view, could be in some way right. And it's about those ambiguities. And I think that's why the theatre is always so much more exciting maybe than the polemical writing. And in this particular play, it's interesting that the devil is given some really hard-hitting lines. And that again connects with Hoveyda in Iran, who was, like I say, very articulate and was interested in intellectual debate.
I find it really exciting to hear about somebody taking an original work like that and shaping it to their circumstances, and not just in terms of design or directorial interpretation, but actually adding words to fit it. Nikki, do we know anything about what Shaw might have thought about that kind of license being taken with political intent with his work?
He was very conservative about his texts. He really wouldn't accept any kind, particularly not editing. He insisted that the whole plays had to be played. There was a question, I think, with the New York production of Heartbreak House, that it was playing too long for all the buses or the trains would be gone by the time it was finished, and he said, "We'll just run them later." He was very uncompromising about the texts, and I suspect, therefore, he would have been conservative about changes made to the text, but you could never rely on Shaw to take a consistent line on anything, because, for instance, Pygmalion, famously, he was infuriated by the first production of Pygmalion, which implied a kind of happy ending. And yet he allowed the film director, this very strange Hungarian guy whom he just liked, he allowed him to get away with the ending of the film, which is also implying a happy ending. So you wouldn't know. And possibly if he was committed to the political cause in question, he might well have tolerated some sort of change like that.
Yeah, I think the complaint about people not being able to get home on the bus was also made of Tom Murphy's,
yes.
Was it the Sanctuary Lamp, was it? I'm not sure which one. Yeah.
It was the Geely concert. Yeah.
Oh, the Geely concert, of course, yeah. We have a question in from Aisling Smith, to Nikki in particular, but Sudaba, you might have some thoughts on this as well. What are your thoughts about Shaw's views on nationalism? I ask this as this would be one area of his political criticism I consider very relevant to contemporary society.
He was against it, totally against it. But in the case of Ireland, he felt that independence, some form of independence, had to come before they could deal with any of the other problems. In the preface to John Bull's Other Island, he says, "Nationalism stands between us and the light of the world. As far as he was concerned, the light of the world was international socialism, and nationalism was this petty interruption to the progress of politics towards international socialism." But he also says in that preface, he says, "If you break a man's bones, he will think of nothing until those bones are set. If you break a country's nationality, he will think of nothing until it is put right." So although he was completely against the Easter 1916 Rising, he thought it was a terrible mistake, he yet very courageously defended the leaders of the Rising at the time they were threatened with execution, and of course tried to write a defense for Roger Casement when he was being tried for treason.
So Dabo, would you like to broaden that out into the issue of imperialism? And actually one of the things I picked up in your article that I was intrigued by was that, so Shaw was obviously seen in the context as kind of anti-imperialist, but also he seems to have been championed in Iran by people associated with the British Embassy, the British Council, etc. So how is he perceived there on those issues?
Again, I think that's a really interesting question to think about, that relationship between Shaw and nationalism and internationalism as well. So I read Arms and the Man, for instance, in this article through Jalal al-Ahmad's seminal work, Gharb Zadagi, as it's often translated translated as Westoxification. And he's the kind of this nationalist figure in ways that is actually an anti-colonial figure who is opposing the infiltration of Western culture, values, and economics into Iranian society. But somehow he finds something in Shaw's work that connects with his ideas. And I think Jalal al-Ahmad is not the only one. There are other anti-colonial figures outside of the West who champion Shaw's work in some way. And I think that his position as an Irishman, as an outsider, and he kind of often presented his criticism as something that was valid and he could do because he was an outsider, an Irishman commenting on British politics. I think that role of him as an outsider is something that some of these figures like Jalal al-Ahmad connect with, that see him as this critic of Western democracy, which they are suspicious about because outside of the West, it doesn't seem to be much about kind of these policies aren't about freedom or about democracy as such. But yeah, there was also the British embassy at the same time was also staging Pygmalion, so there's all sorts of contradictions there.
A final question. We're pretty much out of time, but excuse me. We're Shaw with us today. Would he be cancelled? Can we tolerate in our public debate today the kind of mercurial, eccentric, contrarian breadth of opinion that we associate with Shaw?
Well, I don't see why not. I think he would never have been off the television if he was around at the moment. And I think, you know, we love contrarians. We love people who say things that are the unsayable. One of them 4 years ago got elected president of the United States of America. I think the question really is whether the kind of challenges that Shaw was prepared to put up to the establishment, to current thinking, whether that would be acceptable. I mean, the classic case would be his huge long pamphlet, Common Sense About the War, published in very early in the war, in November 1914, and which was very, very hard hitting, essentially said that the war was a ghastly mistake, that was both sides were responsible. And he was ostracized within Britain for that pamphlet. So I think he was prepared to speak truth to power. And we don't have very many of them around.
Sudhapa?
I think something that I think we might find difficult today to deal with is also Shaw's style. Shaw's is often known as someone who, you know, talk, and he writes about so many different things. I think we're increasingly living in a world where we are seeking simple answers to very complex questions and issues. And just going back to the American president, I mean, he's communicating complex issues of politics, domestic and foreign policy via Twitter in however many characters you can use. Although I think Shaw would have perhaps been actually quite good at using Twitter, as he often was in it, adapting himself to the new medias that emerged. But I think that interest in debate, in rational argument, in complicating things, having nuanced debate, I think that's actually, for me, it's something that's refreshing in Shaw, and maybe it's something that we need more of today.
Mm-hmm. A Shavian Twitter thread.
Yes.
Trolling
all the politicians.
Oh, yeah. Aileen Rowan sends a message, points out, in fact, that there have been attempts to cancel Shaw. One of the drama schools in London, was it Lambda or RADA, wanted to remove his name from a theatre. So anyway, it is a complex issue. We're out of time, so thank you so much to both of you, and I will hand you back to our hosts. I think it's Ruth Hegarty going to take over again.
Thanks very much, Colin, and thank you, Nikki and Sudhava. That was really interesting, and I think he'd probably pretty definitely be cancelled in my opinion. But I'm going to turn over now to Chris Wixon. He's the reason we're all here, because he's the editor of Shaw, the Journal of Bernard Shaw Studies. So Chris, if you can turn on your camera there and unmute yourself. We just hear a little bit about the journal and how you can access it.
Thank you, Ruth, very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Well, quickly, this is the journal's 40th year. It's published twice a year through the Penn State University Press, and Ruth and Barry have edited our terrific December issue, which will be available in a few short weeks, dedicated to the topic of Shaw and legacy. And so, in addition to insightful and provocative essays and interviews, the issue contains many treats, including a play extract, book reviews, and our annual bibliographical checklist of Shaviana. So if you'd like to read more from our illustrious speakers this afternoon, or just remain in the loop with the best current thinking on Shaw and his writing, I hope you will consider subscribing. I would like to thank today's speakers for sharing their work in our pages, and also strongly encourage other scholars and theater practitioners to consider the journal as an outlet for their own research and creative activity, and help to sustain and enrich Shaw studies in the 21st century. Thank you for such a stimulating conversation this afternoon, and I will turn things back to Ruth.
Yes, well, thank you all very much. If the panelists want to turn on their videos one last time so that we can say goodbye and thank you. Thank you to Adrian, to Aileen, to Colin, to Nikki, and to Sudhava. And on behalf of myself and Barry, I'd like to thank you all. This has been recorded, so it will be available afterwards. You'll be able to watch it. And I hope that you will keep an eye out for the journal. And as Chris said, maybe write for it yourself if you're able to do it. We do have an exhibition online on Shaw, and we've been tweeting about that today, so you can see that. And Fintan O'Toole's book, Judging Shaw, is still available. But there's also a Zoom performance of some Shaw work at 7:30 tonight, I think. And we'll tweet the link to that too, if any of you want to continue your Shaw Days anniversary marking of that. So thank you all very much for coming, and the session is now ended. Thank you.